Excellent dairy bread, made without yeast. Some years since, when unfermented bread was first becoming known, I had it tried very successfully in the following manner, and I have since been told that an almost similar method of preparing it is common in many remote parts both of England and Ireland, where it is almost impossible to procure a constant supply of yeast. Blend well together a teaspoonful of pounded sugar and 50 grains of the purest carbonate of soda. Mix a saltspoonful of salt with a pound of flour, and rub the soda and sugar through a hair sieve into it. Stir and mingle them well, and make them quickly into a firm but not hard dough, with sour buttermilk. Bake the loaf well in a thoroughly heated but not fierce oven. In a brick or in a good iron oven, a few minutes less than an hour would be sufficient to bake a loaf of similar weight. The buttermilk should be kept till it is quite acid, but it must never be in the slightest degree rancid or otherwise bad. All unfermented bread, it must be repeated, should be placed in the oven directly it is made, or it will be heavy. For a larger baking, allow rather less than an ounce of soda to the gallon, 7 pounds of flour. Observation. There are cases in which a knowledge of this or of any other equally easy mode of bread-making would be invaluable. The inhabitants of the Isle of Skye depend entirely for bread on supplies brought to them from Glasgow, and they are often entirely without when the steamer, which ought to arrive at intervals of 8 days, is delayed by stress of weather. The residents are then compelled to have recourse to scones, as a mixture of flour and water and a little soda, cooked on a flat iron plate, is called, or to ship's biscuit, and these are often found unsuitable for young children and invalids. There are no ovens in the houses, though there are grates for coal fires, in front of which small loaves of unfermented bread could be baked extremely well in good American ovens, or better still in the small revolving portable ones invented by Mr. Bowles, of which mention has already been made. Buttermilk can always be procured, and if not, a provision of carbonate of soda and muriatic acid might be kept at hand to ensure the means of making wholesome bread. In many other localities the same plan might prove of equal benefit. Rice bread, the rectory receipt. I am indebted for the following receipt to an admirable housekeeper, the wife of a country clergyman, in whose own words I present it to the reader. It is given with so much exactness in all its details, that I have not considered it needful to have it tested before inserting it here, especially as it is the result of positive and long experience. We have been for some time in the habit of using a portion of rice for our bread. We commenced this plan when flour was very dear, and we think the bread so much improved by the addition that now we seldom omit it. We generally bake 2 stone, that is to say 4 gallons, or 28 pounds, of flour, and for this quantity we allow 2 pounds of rice. We first wash the rice, and then soak it for 3 or 4 hours in 6 pints of water. It is next turned, with the whole of the water, into a large tin dish with a cover. A Nottingham jar well tied down would be a good substitute for this, and put it into a tolerably hot oven for 2 hours, when it will be nicely swollen, and will have absorbed all the water. When it has cooled down sufficiently to be handled easily, we rub it into half the flour, in the same way that we should rub butter or lard into it for pastry, and proceed to make the bread. If we can procure good home-brewed yeast, we prefer it to any other and find 1/4 of a pint sufficient for our baking. But we very frequently use baker's yeast, which we find we can depend on better than on brewers. It is a thin liquid, somewhat resembling beer, of which we are obliged to mix 3/4 of a pint with the dough. We add first to the flour and rice 2 small handfuls of salt, and then wet them up gradually with 10 pints of warm water, reserving the yeast until they are tolerably well moistened, when we pour it equally over the mass and beat it in well with the hand, and knead it about. This dough will be very lithe. We make it about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and place it by the fire, or on the top of the oven, where it remains until 9 in the evening, when 3/4 of a stone, 1.5 gallons more of flour is kneaded into it, and it is left to rise until the morning, when the remaining 1/2 gallon of flour will fit it for the oven. It should be put into large tins and allowed to rise to their tops before it is set into the oven. We divide it into 10 loaves, which are baked for 2 hours. We consider that the rice renders the bread lighter, and prevents the crust of it from becoming hard, and it materially increases its weight. The 4 gallons of flour, 2 pounds of rice, and 16 pints of water produce 42 pounds of excellent bread. To improve the yeast and ensure its being good, I would recommend that 3 or 4 well-boiled potatoes should be smoothly mashed and mixed with as much hot water as will bring them to the consistence of batter, and that a small plateful of warm flour and the yeast should be gradually added and well beaten to them. This done, the mixture must be placed before the fire, and in 2 hours, or less, the whole bowl will be in a state of fermentation. Then is the time to lay the bread with it. It is a little additional trouble, but is a certain improvement also. Servants, however, will not often take all this trouble, and mistresses cannot always attend to such matters themselves. 2 pounds of rice soaked in 3 quarts of water, and afterwards swollen in it for 2 hours in a moderately hot oven, to be cooled down a little, then worked into a stone, 2 gallons of flour, 2 small handfuls of salt, 1/4 of a pint of yeast of home-brewed beer, or 3/4 of a pint of baker's yeast, and 5 quarts of warm water to be added to them, and well mixed into a live dough. To stand near the fire, or on the top of the stove-oven, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 9 in the evening. 1.5 gallons more of flour worked into it, left until the morning. The remaining 1/2 gallon of flour used in kneading and making it ready for the oven. This dough is divided into 10 loaves, put into large square tins, left until it has risen to their tops, put immediately into a well-heated oven, and baked for 2 hours. The product of this receipt, 42 pounds of bread. Note, with the addition of about 12 pounds of brown bread, this, says our correspondent, is our average weekly consumption for a family of 10 or 11 persons. Small breakfast loaves or rolls, cold made. As bread made in the usual way, when prepared overnight for early baking on the morrow, is liable to ferment too much in very sultry weather, I recommend the following method, which I have many times had tried with entire success, as very convenient, and as producing at the same time bread of excellent quality. Mix with 2 pounds of fine wheaten flour a saltspoonful of salt, and put into a basin half as much finely powdered sugar, with a teaspoonful only of solid yeast, which has been procured at least 1 day before, and stirred up with plenty of spring water, as already directed in another part of this volume. Mix these well with nearly 3/4 of a pint of new milk, and proceed to make the flour into a firm and smooth dough. Add, in doing this, a little more milk if required. Flour a thick cloth lightly, roll the bread closely in it, turn the ends under, lay it into a pan, and throw another cloth, once or twice folded, on it. Place it on a table away from a thorough draught of air, and leave it until the morning. Before lighting the fire, knead it down, should it appear very light, as it ought to be, and either leave it until the oven is nearly hot enough to bake it, or make it up at once into small loaves or rolls, and let them remain upon a tin until it is ready for them. Our bread made in this way has been excellent, both in colour and in flavour. Baked in a brick oven, it would probably be better still. We had it made about 10 o'clock in the evening, and baked between 8 and 9 the next morning, in an iron oven, moderately heated. The rolls, which were not small, remained in it 3/4 of an hour. They were perfectly light, and tasted almost like cake. Fine wheaten flour, 2 pounds, 1 saltspoonful of salt, and half as much pounded sugar. Solid brewer's yeast, 1 teaspoonful. New milk, or equal parts of milk and water, 3/4 of a pint. A little in addition, if required, to make up the paste quite firmly. To remain all night. Kneaded down in the morning, and moulded into rolls or small loaves. To prove about 1 hour. Baked from 20 to 30 minutes if small, longer if large, in iron stove oven. Observation: by solid brewer's or beer yeast is meant at all times here yeast which has been washed or purified by having been mixed with plenty of water and then allowed to subside until the water could be poured clear from it. Bread experiences. For works of a practical nature, our own everyday experience, even though small, is of more positive utility than a large amount of information derived merely from hearsay or from books, because the successful working of any process is often more or less affected by many trifling circumstances which escape observation at first and which are rendered apparent only by repeated trials. For this reason I give, familiarly and in detail, in what I shall call my bread experiences, the result of my own close observation of the effects produced by various influences on the receipts which I have myself had carried into practice for daily domestic use. In following these, or any others contained in the present volume, all due allowance must be made for the difference of temperature in various parts of England, for in the south, where these have all been tested with full success, the natural warmth of the atmosphere is sufficient in midsummer to excite and to maintain the fermentation of bread dough to the proper degree, and the cold of winter seldom approaches in rigour that of our northerly or wild moorland districts. But whenever and wherever it is severe, all precaution must be taken to protect both the yeast and the dough from its effects. Footnote: it is well to warm the bread pan or tub, and the flour also, before using them for dough in seasons of excessive cold, and thick coverings should be laid over, but not upon, the dough after it is made. End footnote. The foregoing receipt for breakfast bread was the result of a first experiment, made some years since, with cold ingredients, and a very small proportion of yeast, and answered admirably. But more recent trials of the same process, with German yeast, have been attended with an equally good effect in many hours less of time. A Summer Bread, No. 1, June 1856. Flour 4 pounds, mixed in a very large bowl with a teaspoonful of salt. the middle made hollow, and a single tablespoonful of brewer's yeast, which has been well watered for 2 days and kept in a cool larder, very smoothly mixed with a pint of cold milk and water, of which 1 part of 3 was new milk and 2 were filtered water, poured in and stirred and beaten well with as much of the surrounding flour as made it into a stiff batter. On this a thick layer of flour was strewed, the spoon removed, and a large cloth, twice doubled, was laid over the pan, which was placed on a table in a north room. It was left for 2 hours, when the sponge had quite burst through the flour, and risen much, and was immediately made into a firm dough, with the addition to the sponge of about 1/4 of a pint of warm water. In from half to 3/4 of an hour it was divided, and very lightly kneaded up into 2 loaves, put into shallow, round baking dishes, previously rubbed with butter, placed on a tray, covered with a thick double cloth, and sent to a baker's oven, which was 1/4 of a mile distant. This bread proved excellent. Flour, 4 pounds, salt, 1 teaspoonful, brewer's yeast, 2 days watered, 1 tablespoonful, cold milk and water, 1 pint, 2 hours, warm water, 1/4 of a pint, kneaded into firm dough, rising nearly 3/4 of an hour. Summer bread, number 2, July 4th. 1.5 gallons of flour and a dessertspoonful of salt were made at once into a firm, well-kneaded dough with 1 ounce only, a pennyworth, of German yeast, smoothly diluted with part of nearly 5 pints of weak milk and water, all of which was used quite cold. The pan, covered with a thick cloth, was then placed in a room without a fire, but with the door and windows closed, and left for 2.5 hours, or rather longer. The dough, which was then perfectly light, was well kneaded a second time, and in half an hour afterwards was made up lightly into 5 loaves of different sizes, and sent, in shallow pans, to a baker's oven. This bread was exceedingly good, and very light, proving the small quantity of yeast really required for use in general during the summer months. Flour, 1.5 gallons, salt, 1 dessertspoonful, German yeast, 1 ounce, good new milk, full 3/4 of a pint, cold water, exact imperial measure, 2 quarts, rising 2.5 to 3 hours, kneaded down, rising again 1/2 to 3/4 of an hour, 5 loaves. These, if of equal size, would not require, in a well-heated brick oven, more than 1.25 hours baking, perhaps rather less. In a common iron oven, more time might be needed for them. Summer bread, number 3, September 8th, 1856. The ounce or pennyworth of German yeast with which this bread was made was brought in from a baker's late on the evening of Friday, September 5th, and put immediately into an exact 1/2 pint of cold filtered water, and remained undisturbed in a cool larder until about 1 o'clock on the following Monday. When the water was then gently poured from it, it was found to have settled at the bottom of the jug, and was perfectly sweet. It was mixed with 3/4 of a pint of water, in addition to that which was originally stirred to it, the whole being fully milk-warm, and 3.5 pounds, 1 quartern of the best flour, purchased from a factor in Tottenham Court Road, with a large teaspoonful of salt, were kneaded up with it into a very smooth dough, which at the end of an hour had become exceedingly light. It was then again kneaded into a smooth mass and left for nearly 3/4 of an hour, when it was sent to a baker's oven after being divided into one small and one large loaf. It was well baked in pans, and proved in every respect excellent bread, though rather less yeast would have been sufficient for it. I give these minute particulars to show that the German yeast may be preserved fit for use in the same manner as brewers, when the weather is not excessively sultry. During part of the month of August last, when the heat was unusually intense, all kinds of yeast appeared to be more or less affected by it, and it was extremely difficult to obtain good bread in consequence. In such a case, it is well to have recourse to unfermented bread. German yeast, 1 ounce, put into half a pint of cold filtered water, which was not changed, on Friday evening, September 5th, kept in cool larder until Monday, September 8th. Diluted altogether with 1 pint and a quarter of warm water, and mixed with 1 quartern, half a gallon, flour, and 1 large teaspoonful of salt. Left to rise 1 hour. Kneaded down. Left 3/4 of an hour. Divided and sent to oven. Bread very good and light. Observation. Generally, it will be better to change the water gently into which the yeast is dropped. The following memoranda of small bakings are inserted to show the average weight of the bread obtained from a gallon, 7 pounds, of flour, much of which was purchased from the baker to whom the bread was sent to be baked, and not reweighed before it was used. Occasionally, the best quality of country flour supplied the place of this, which will probably account for some difference in the quantity of liquid used for the dough, and the amount of the product in bread. Number 1. Flour half a gallon, 3 pounds and a half. Salt, 1 small teaspoonful. German yeast, half an ounce. Warm milk and water, 1 pint and a half. Kneaded up at once, rising altogether 2 hours and a quarter. When baked, weighed exactly 4 pounds and a half. Number 2. Flour, 7 pounds, 1 gallon. German yeast, 1 ounce. Milk and water, moderately warm, 2 pints and 3/4. Made into dough at once, rising 2 hours and a half. Weighed after baking, 9 pounds minus 1 ounce. Number 3. February. Flour, 1 gallon. Salt, 1 teaspoonful. Yeast, 1 ounce. Milk and water, 2 pints and full half. Rising 2 hours and a half. Weighed in bread, 9 pounds and a half. Number 4. Flour, 3 pounds. Yeast, nearly half an ounce. Salt, as usual. Liquid, 1 pint and a quarter. Rising 2 hours. Weighed 3 pounds 12 ounces. These slight examples will serve as some guide to the practical housewife who may wish to know the most minute particulars connected with domestic bread-making. For the present, further space cannot well be dedicated to such details, lest it should compel the omission of other matter which is equally essential. Excellent Suffolk bread. It is scarcely possible to have bread superior to that made by the receipt which I insert here, and which I give to show how perfectly the plan of slow fermentation answers when it is well conducted, as it was in the following instance. The bread, I must observe, was sent to me from a distance, and was made by a servant who a few months before knew little or nothing of the art of preparing it, but who had the good sense to profit by the instructions which were offered to her, and who is now an excellent bread-maker, much to her own advantage, as well as to that of her employers. Cook mixed a tablespoonful and a half of good yeast, fresh from the brewery, with nearly 3 pints of warm milk and water, and make up a gallon of flour with it into a firm dough at once. after she had stirred in a dessertspoonful of salt. It was then left to rise from 2 to 3 hours, turned on to a pasteboard and well kneaded, and again left in the pan until it was ready to send to the oven. It was rising altogether between 4 and 5 hours, and was baked in 2 large tins at the baker's. The tops of the loaves were glazed with beaten egg. Good and quite fresh brewer's yeast, 1 tablespoonful and a half. Best Suffolk flour, 1 gallon. Salt, 1 dessertspoonful. Warm milk and water, nearly 3 pints. Rising altogether between 4 and 5 hours. Baked in 2 loaves at baker's oven from 1 hour and a half to 2 hours. Observations. Very lately I have received another equally good specimen with the above, of bread made by the same servant. A larger weight of flour was perfectly leavened with nearly the same quantity of yeast, and not the finest London bread, artificially whitened, could surpass it in appearance or in texture. The purity of all the ingredients used was doubtless one cause of its excellence. The yeast, as well as the flour, must have been extremely good. A French receipt for French bread. Sift a gallon of the very best flour through a hair sieve, and mix with it 2 ounces of fine salt. Dissolve 1/4 pound of butter in a pint of new milk, and when it is sufficiently cooled down, stir it to another pint or pint and a half, which has been very smoothly blended with 2 ounces of fresh German yeast, or with 3 tablespoonfuls of home-brewed or of brewer's yeast, which has stood for a night after being stirred up with plenty of water. Make the flour with these, and as much more warm new milk as may be needed, into a light dough, and leave it until it has risen to its fullest height, but do not let it begin to sink. Knead it up, and divide it into loaves of 1 or 2 pounds weight, and form them into rouleaux. Place them some inches apart upon flat baking tins, and set them in a warm place to prove, or rise again, and when they have swollen considerably, dispatch them to a quite quick oven. From 20 to 30 minutes will bake them should they be small, and longer time must be allowed when they are large. But, from their form, they will not require such long baking as round high loaves do. They should be well browned, and be rasped as soon as they are perfectly cold. Sometimes as much as 3/4 pound of butter is used for them, which is far more than is needed, or than is wholesome. Sometimes they are made entirely without, and are still very good, if rich new milk be used for them. Nearly a quart of this will be required for the gallon of flour. As I have stated before, a little cream is an excellent substitute for butter in bread. Ginger loaf or rolls. Mix intimately 2 ounces of good powdered ginger, called in the shops prepared ginger, and a little salt, with 2 pounds of flour, and make it into a firm but perfectly light dough with German or brewer's yeast, in the usual manner. Bake it either in 1 loaf, or divide it into 6 or 8 small ones. Flour, 2 pounds, prepared ginger, 2 ounces, little salt, German yeast, 1/2 ounce, or brewer's yeast, 1 large dessert spoonful, milk or milk and water, 1 pint. To rise 1 hour, or until quite light, to be kneaded down and left again to rise until light. Remark: when diarrhea or other complaints of a similar nature are prevalent, this bread will be found of excellent effect, especially in travelling. Far better, indeed, than many of the compounds to which people have recourse to avert disturbance of the system. The proportion of ginger can be much increased if desired, but the bread should not then be habitually eaten for a long continuance, as the excess of any stimulating condiment is often in many ways injurious. Rather less than the pint of milk will often prove sufficient. Plain rolls. Any kind of light fermented bread may easily be converted into rolls by allowing the dough to rise much more than the usual time, after it has once been kneaded down. This is better than making them with a large proportion of yeast. When the dough has swollen to its full height, turn it on to the pasteboard and divide it into parts of equal size. Work them up very lightly into the form of rolls and place them on tins, leaving spaces of 2 fingers' width between them. Let them stand a while to prove or swell again, then bake them for about 20 minutes in a somewhat quick oven. To keep them hot until they are wanted for table, wrap them in a warm, thick flannel, which should be kept for the purpose, and lay them into a pan or basket placed near the fire. The dough used for them should be made entirely, or in part, with milk. Good dinner or breakfast rolls. Crumble down, very small indeed, an ounce of butter into a couple of pounds of the best flour, and mix with them a large saltspoonful of salt. Put into a basin a dessertspoonful of solid, well-purified yeast, and half a teaspoonful of pounded sugar. Mix these with half a pint of warm new milk. Hollow the center of the flour. Pour in the yeast gradually, stirring to it sufficient of the surrounding flour to make a thick batter. Strew more flour on the top, cover a thick double cloth over the pan, and let it stand in a warm kitchen to rise. In winter it must be placed within a few feet of the fire. In about an hour, should the sponge have broken through the flour on the top and have risen considerably in height, mix 1 lightly whisked egg, or the yolks of 2, with nearly half a pint more of quite warm new milk, and wet up the mass into a very smooth dough. Cover it as before, and in from half to 3/4 of an hour, turn it on to a pasteboard, and divide it into 24 portions of equal size. Knead these up as lightly as possible into small round or oval-shaped rolls. Make a slight incision round them, and cut them once or twice across the top, placing them as they are done on slightly floured baking sheets, an inch or 2 apart. Let them remain for 15 or 20 minutes to prove. Then wash the tops with yolk of egg, mixed with a little milk, and bake them in a rather quick oven from 10 to 12 minutes. Turn them upside down upon a dish to cool after they are taken from the tins. An additional ounce of butter and another egg can be used for these rolls when richer bread is liked. But it is so much less wholesome than a more simple kind, that it is not to be recommended. When it can easily be procured, a cup of good cream is an admirable substitute for butter altogether, rendering the rolls exceedingly delicate both in appearance and in flavour. The yeast used for them should be stirred up with plenty of cold water 1 day, at least, before it is wanted. Half an ounce of German yeast will have an equally good effect, and can often be procured more easily in these days than good brewer's yeast. Flour, 2 pounds, butter, 1 ounce, sugar, half teaspoonful, salt, 1 saltspoonful, new milk, half pint. To rise about 1 hour, additional milk, nearly half pint, 1 whole egg or yolks of 2, 3/4 of an hour, baked in 24 small rolls, 10 to 12 minutes, in rather quick oven. Polenta. Polenta is the name under which Italian flour of maize is sold at the foreign warehouses in this country. It is much superior in quality to that which is imported from America, and is harvested with more care. But its consumption here is comparatively small, and it is sold at a price which must, while it is maintained, prevent its general use for bread, of which it makes a pleasant variety when mixed with twice the quantity of wheaten flour. Blend intimately in an earthen pan 1 pint of the polenta with a quart of the best flour, and rather less than the usual proportion of salt. Dilute gradually a dessert-spoonful of solid yeast, or half an ounce of German yeast, with a pint of warm new milk. A few spoonfuls more than this quantity may be required, but it is better not to add it at first. And make the dough up at once. Let it be firm without being hard, as it will become lithe in rising. Leave it covered with a cloth until it appears quite light, then knead it down thoroughly and let it again stand to rise. Divide it into large rolls or small oval loaves, place them some distance apart on a floured tin, and bake them in a moderate oven from 3/4 of an hour to an hour. The polenta imparts a pleasant flavour to this bread, which eats almost like rice cake. Which it may be made to resemble still further by dissolving an ounce of butter in the milk with which it is made. Footnote: I am informed that the polenta is carefully granulated between large stones set in a peculiar manner for the purpose. This probably renders it so dissimilar to the common maize flour. The variety of Indian corn from which it is prepared is much smaller than that grown commonly in America. End footnote. Polenta, 1 pint. Wheat flour, 1 quart. Little salt. Solid yeast, 1 dessert-spoonful, or 4 ounces German yeast. Milk, 1 pint or rather more. Observation: American maize flour can be substituted for the polenta in this receipt at any time. Coconut bread or rolls. The oil contained in the coconut imparts a peculiar richness to bread, biscuits, and cakes, as well as to various other preparations of food, and to many persons its flavour is very agreeable. The rasped nut, therefore, when fresh, may be used with advantage for them. Even the slightest degree rancid, it will produce a very unpleasant effect. Put 4 ounces of the finely grated nut into a quart of new milk. Footnote: This proportion of a full-flavoured nut is sufficient, but it can always be increased at pleasure. It should be grated down on a delicately clean and bright grater, or on occasion it may be infused in the milk, after having been merely pared, sliced thin, and cut up small. But a much larger quantity of it must then be used to impart an equal degree of flavour. End footnote. Heat it slowly, and let it simmer very gently indeed, that there may be no great reduction of the quantity, for about 3/4 of an hour. Then withdraw it from the fire, and when it has cooled down a little, strain it through a fine sieve or cloth with so much pressure as shall leave the nut quite dry. Use the milk while it is still warm with yeast and flour as for common bread, and manage it in exactly the same manner. The grated nut in substance may be used instead of the flavoured milk, but the bread will then be less delicate and less wholesome. When this is done, it should be thoroughly blended with the flour before the dough is moistened. Rasped fresh coconut, 1/4 pound. Milk, 1 quart. Simmered 3/4 of an hour. The milk expressed from the nut to be used for dough in the usual manner. Or, with each pound of flour, 3 ounces of the grated nut to be well mixed, and the yeast and liquid to be added. Observation: The oil of the nut will render it necessary to reduce, for this last method, the ordinary proportion of liquid used for dough. Turkish rolls. Blanch and pound to a perfectly smooth paste some fine Jordan almonds. Moisten them gradually with boiling milk or thin cream, and then simmer them for a few minutes together. Wring the milk from the almonds with strong pressure through a thick cloth or a tammy, and use it like other milk for making the required quantity of the best flour into dough. It may be slightly tinged with saffron when it is liked, and sweetened with a small quantity of pounded sugar. Jordan almonds, 6 ounces. Milk, 1½ pint. Best flour, 2 to 3 pounds. German yeast, 1/2 to 3/4 ounces. Rising as usual. Brown caraway or Newcastle bread. This may be made either with wheaten meal or with 2 parts of flour and 1 of sharps or middlings. With the addition of a little sugar, it will resemble a common cake, and will usually be very acceptable to children, to many of whom it will also be suitable and wholesome. Put rather less than the usual quantity of salt into a quartern of meal, or of meal and flour, or of flour and sharps mixed, and stir well into it 3 ounces of fresh whole caraway seeds, or 2 ounces which have been ground. When they are properly mingled, proceed to make the dough with full 3/4 of an ounce of German yeast, or a large tablespoonful of purified beer yeast, and as much skimmed milk, or new milk and water, as will render it moderately firm. Less than 1.5 pints of liquid will be needed for it when any portion of sugar is added, as this has always a softening effect in paste. It must be left to rise, and be kneaded down at the proper time like other bread. About 2 hours altogether will fit it for the oven, sometimes rather less. Precise directions for the general management of dough do not need repetition with each receipt here, as they are so fully given at the commencement of this part of the book that they ought to be sufficient guide without. Observation. In Germany, aniseed is commonly mixed with bread. Indeed, it is sometimes quite difficult to procure any that is free from it, and it is very distasteful to some eaters when flavoured with it. Oaten cakes, called clapped bread. A North Country receipt. The large thin oaten cakes, called clapped bread in the north of England, are made by mixing fine Scotch oatmeal with a little salt and cold water quickly into a moderately stiff paste, and patting it with the hands, with plenty of oatmeal strewed under and over it, until it is as thin as it can be made. The cakes, which should be about the size of a breakfast plate, must be prepared singly, baked on a griddle oven, turned while they are doing, and afterwards toasted a little before the fire to render them crisp. They must always be kept very dry. If mixed with warm water, the paste is more easily made into thin cakes, but is not so short and nice. Oat cakes may be baked in an iron oven when but moderately heated. So much only of the meal should be moistened at once as will serve for a single cake, because the paste dries so rapidly that it cannot be properly managed else. A Scotch cook, celebrated in the family in which she lived for the excellence of her oaten breakfast cakes, used to crumble a bit of butter about the size of a walnut into a quart of meal, wet it up with milk, or water as the case might be, in suitable portions, roll it out as thin as it could be rendered, and bake her cakes in the oven of the kitchen stove. A girdle iron. Oatmeal bannocks. These are made simply of Scotch oatmeal mixed into a paste with water, and made into cakes about the size of a common saucer, and quite 1/2 inch thick. They are then baked of a light brown in a moderate oven. Brown fadge, an Irish breakfast cake. Break up very small 1.5 ounces of butter into a pound of meal just as it comes from the mill. Wholemeal is meant by this, and make it into a paste with about half a pint of milk. Roll it out to the size of a plate, and to the third of an inch thick, and bake it on a griddle or in an oven. If made with buttermilk and a pinch of soda, it will be improved. This is the exact receipt by which the brown fadge is made in Ireland. Where it is served at the breakfast table, even in wealthy households, and in those of some of the nobility. If rich, slightly acid buttermilk were used to make it, and a small but due proportion of carbonate of soda were well mingled with the meal, the butter might be omitted. Meal as it comes from the mill, 1 pound. Butter, 1.5 ounces. Little salt. Nearly half pint of milk. Baked in oven about 20 minutes, or on a griddle. A Sally Lunn, and other very light preparations. To make a batter sponge, which may easily be converted into many different kinds of fancy bread, as it is called, or into buns or cakes, first mix, very smoothly indeed, a pint of warm new milk with 1 ounce of quite fresh German yeast. Footnote: for bread, half this quantity is really sufficient. But when butter is added in any quantity to the mixture, much more will be required. End footnote. Or with the same quantity which has been put into water for 1 night. Footnote: this yeast becomes perfectly smooth by being put into water, and sometimes the surface of it is hardened, so as to render this an advantage. End footnote. And make with them 1 pound of the best flour into a batter entirely free from lumps. A saltspoonful of fine salt should previously be well stirred to it. Throw a cloth over the pan and place it where the air is warm. When it has risen extremely high and the surface is covered with large bubbles, take another pound of flour, which in winter it is well to have slightly warmed before it is used. Stir and beat smoothly part of it into the sponge, and when it is firm enough, knead in the remainder until the whole is perfectly blended. The dough thus made will soon be ready for the oven, and may be moulded into small shapes, placed some inches apart on a flat tin, as they will spread and rise considerably. Glazed with beaten egg, and rather quickly baked, or the dough, when first made, may at once be put into tins or pans, and left in them to rise to its full height before it is placed in the oven. To make a Sally Lunn, dissolve 3 ounces of good butter, cut small, in less than half of the milk with which the sponge is to be set. Cool it down with the remainder, and, if a sweetened preparation be liked, stir 3 ounces of pounded sugar to the flour before it is moistened. Pour gradually the milk and butter to the yeast, of which there must be a full ounce, and proceed in all else as above. 3 hours will sometimes be required to bring this sponge to its height. When it is ready, add the 2nd pound of flour to it. Put it into a round buttered tin or tins, which it should not more than half fill, and when it has risen nearly to the edge, let it be put without delay into the oven, and baked a nice brown. An egg or two, when they are considered requisite, can be mixed with the milk and butter, either for the Sally Lunn, or to convert the dough into buns. But, to allow for the addition, a few spoonfuls of the milk should be omitted. Caraway seeds, currants, or candied citron or orange rind can be kneaded in with the other ingredients when the 2nd pound of flour is mixed with the sponge, or immediately after it is worked in. 2 or 3 ounces more of sugar may, for many tastes, be thought needful for the buns. Bread, best flour, 1 pound, new milk, 1 pint, little salt. German yeast, ½ ounce, to rise 2 hours or more, or yeast, 1 ounce, 1 to 2 hours. Flour, 1 additional pound, to rise 1/2 to 3/4 hour. Salilun, flour, 1 pound, butter, 3 ounces, pounded sugar, 3 ounces, German yeast, full ounce, 2 to 3 hours, or until extremely light. Flour, in addition, 1 pound, to stand in tins until risen to their edges. Buns, butter, yeast, and milk, as above, with an addition of sugar and an egg or 2 at pleasure. Caraway seeds, 1 ounce, or currants, ½ pound.